Philadelphia, spring of 1897. Along Old York Road in Elkins Park, construction workers arrived before dawn, hauling limestone blocks the size of carriages up a muddy hillside. The air smelled of wet earth and sawdust. Horses strained against their harnesses, dragging timber beams toward what would become the largest private residence ever built in the United States. This was not a palace for a president. It was not a monument commissioned by the government. It was one man's attempt to build permanence in a world that had taught him nothing lasts forever. His name was Peter Arrell Brown Widener, and by 1897, he was one of the richest men in America. Streetcars, utilities, steel, oil. His fortune stretched across industries and continents. He owned art that kings envied. He dined with Vanderbilts and Asterns. He had survived poverty, built an empire, and watched his children grow into positions of power and privilege. Yet something inside him remained unsatisfied, restless, as if all that wealth could not quite erase the memory of the butcher's son from Philadelphia who had started with nothing. So he commissioned a house, not just any house, a 110-room Georgian Revival palace designed by Horace Trumbauer, the architect who would later design the Philadelphia Museum of Art. The estate would sit on 480 acres of rolling Pennsylvania farmland, surrounded by gardens, stables, and greenhouses. It would have its own power plant, its own water system, its own private railway siding. The ballroom alone could hold 1,000 guests. The art collection would eventually include works by Rembrandt, Raphael, Van Dyck, and Donatello, pieces so valuable that museums around the world would beg to borrow them. Peter Widener called it Lynnewood Hall. He told friends it would be a family seat, a legacy that would endure for generations, a place where his children and grandchildren could gather, where his name would be remembered not just for the money he made, but for the beauty he preserved. He was wrong. Within a single generation, Lynnewood Hall would become a tomb. The gardens would turn to weeds. The windows would go dark. The art would vanish into museums and private collections. And the mansion itself, once the crown jewel of the Gilded Age, would sit abandoned for decades. Too big to sell, too expensive to maintain, too haunting to ignore. Today, if you drive past Lynnewood Hall, you will see a structure that looks like a corpse dressed in formal clothes. The limestone facade still stands, elegant and imposing, but the roof leaks, the plaster crumbles, the marble staircases lead to rooms filled with debris and shadow. Pigeons nest in the ballroom, graffiti stains the walls. The silence inside is so thick it feels like drowning. This is the dark story of Lynnewood Hall. Not just the story of its construction, but the story of what happened after. The story of a man who tried to buy immortality and failed. The story of a family shattered by tragedy, guilt, and unimaginable loss. The story of servants who kept the machine running while the people upstairs slowly came apart. And the story of a house that became a prison, then a museum, then a monument to decay. If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Before we can understand how Lynnewood Hall became a ruin, we have to understand the man who built it. And to understand Peter Widener, we have to go back to the streets of Philadelphia in the 1830s, when the city smelled of coal smoke and horse manure, and a young boy learned that survival meant working harder than everyone around you. Peter Arrell Brown Widener was born on July 13, 1834, in Philadelphia. His father was a butcher, not a prosperous one. The Wideners lived in a cramped row house in a working-class neighborhood where everyone knew your business and no one had much to hide. Money was always tight. Food was simple. The future was uncertain. Peter's childhood was not tragic in the dramatic sense. No Dickensian workhouse, no orphanage, no abusive stepfather. But it was hard in the quiet, grinding way that poverty usually is. He left school at 13 to help his father in the butcher shop. He learned to wake before dawn, to handle meat in all weather, to smile at customers even when his hands were numb with cold. He learned that the world did not care about fairness. It cared about who worked hardest and who was willing to take risks no one else would touch. At 17, Peter opened his own butcher shop. He was barely old enough to vote, but he already understood something crucial. If you wanted to stop being poor, you had to stop thinking like a poor person. You had to see opportunities where others saw obstacles. You had to move faster, think sharper, and never ever assume the world owed you anything. His first real break came during the Civil War. While other men enlisted or fled, Peter Widener saw a different kind of battlefield. The Union Army needed meat, massive quantities of it, to feed soldiers in camps and on the march. Widener secured contracts to supply mutton to military installations around Philadelphia. It was not glamorous work. It was bloody, exhausting, and logistically nightmarish, but it was profitable. Very profitable. By the time the war ended in 1865, Peter Widener was no longer just a butcher. He was a businessman with capital, connections, and a growing reputation for getting things done. He married Hannah Josephine Dunton in 1858, and together they began to build a family that would eventually include 3 sons, George, Joseph, and Harry. But meat was never the end game. Widener had bigger ambitions. In the 1870s, he shifted his focus to something that was transforming American cities at an astonishing pace: public transportation. Philadelphia's streetcar system was a chaotic patchwork of competing companies, poorly maintained tracks, and inefficient routes. Widener saw the mess and recognized the fortune buried inside it. He began buying up streetcar lines, consolidating operations, and negotiating with city officials who were more than happy to grant lucrative franchises in exchange for the right political favors. This was the Gilded Age. Corruption was not hidden, it was how the system worked. Widener understood that building a fortune meant building relationships with the people who controlled permits, contracts, and regulations. He cultivated friendships with mayors, councilmen, and judges. He attended the right dinners, and slowly, methodically, he assembled a transportation empire that stretched across Philadelphia and beyond. By the 1880s, Widener controlled streetcar lines in multiple cities, including Chicago and New York. He partnered with William Elkins, another self-made millionaire, and together they expanded into utilities, gas companies, electric lighting, water systems. Every household in Philadelphia needed these services. Every business depended on them, and Widener and Elkins were there, collecting the fees, reinvesting the profits, and accumulating wealth at a rate that stunned even their peers. The money came fast, almost obscenely fast. Within 20 years, Peter Widener went from butcher to multi-millionaire. But wealth brought complications. The old Philadelphia families, the ones whose names appeared in history books, who traced their lineage back to colonial governors and Revolutionary War heroes, looked down on men like Widener. He was new money. He was too ambitious, too aggressive, too willing to get his hands dirty. He had clawed his way up from nothing, and in their eyes that made him dangerous. Widener felt the exclusion. He saw it in the way certain invitations never arrived, the way certain clubs quietly refused his membership obligations, the way conversations shifted when he entered a room. His money could buy almost anything: art, yachts, mansions in Newport, but it could not buy the one thing he wanted most: acceptance. The kind of acceptance that came automatically to families who had been wealthy for generations. So he decided to build something that would force them to notice. Something so grand, so undeniably magnificent, that it would silence the whispers and erase the doubts. He would build a palace, a family seat, a monument to the Widener name. In 1997, Peter Widener purchased 480 acres of farmland in Elkins Park, just north of Philadelphia. The site was elevated, offering sweeping views of the surrounding countryside. It was close enough to the city for convenience, but far enough away to feel like an escape. And it was large enough to support the kind of estate that European aristocrats built: gardens, stables, greenhouses, entire landscapes shaped and controlled. He hired Horace Trumbauer, a young architect who had already made a name designing mansions for Philadelphia's elite. Trumbauer was only in his late 20s, but he had a gift for understanding what his clients wanted before they could articulate it themselves. He knew that men like Widener did not just want beautiful houses. They wanted houses that told a story, houses that announced without a single word that the owner had arrived. Trumbauer proposed a Georgian Revival design: clean lines, classical proportions, symmetrical facades. It would echo the great English country houses that had stood for centuries, the kind of architecture that whispered permanence, tradition, and unshakable confidence. The main structure would stretch 200 feet across, with wings extending on either side. The central entrance would be marked by a portico supported by massive columns. Inside, there would be 110 rooms, including a ballroom that could host over 1,000 guests, a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and a grand staircase carved from marble imported from Italy. Peter Widener approved the design. He told Trumbauer to spare no expense. The best materials, the finest craftsmanship, the most advanced technology available. Lynnewood Hall would not just be a house, it would be a statement. Construction began in the spring of 1997, and with it, the clock started ticking on a tragedy no one could yet see. The hill in Elkins Park was not the obvious choice for a mansion. The land sloped unevenly, prone to erosion and pooling water after heavy rains. The soil was thick clay, difficult to dig, harder to stabilize. Local farmers had grazed livestock there for generations, but no one had tried to build anything substantial. The terrain fought back against everything. Peter Widener did not care. He wanted the elevation, he wanted the views. He wanted a site that would allow his mansion to dominate the landscape, visible for miles in every direction. If the land was difficult, then they would reshape it. If the ground was unstable, they would dig deeper, pour more concrete, reinforce the foundations until they could bear the weight of a palace. Horace Trumbauer brought in engineers from New York and Boston. They surveyed the property, calculated load-bearing requirements, and designed a foundation system that went down more than 15 feet in places, anchored to bedrock with steel and stone. It was overkill by the standards of the day, but Widener wanted a house that would last forever, and Trumbauer was determined to give it to him. The workforce swelled to over 300 men by the summer of 1997. Laborers arrived from Philadelphia, many of them recent immigrants, Irish, Italian, Polish, willing to work long hours for wages that barely covered rent and food. They dug trenches, hauled stone, mixed mortar, and laid bricks under a sun that turned the construction site into an oven. Accidents were common. A man fell from a scaffolding and broke his back. Another lost 3 fingers to a cutting saw. These incidents were noted in foremen's logs, but rarely in newspapers. Injuries were expected. Deaths were unfortunate, but not unusual. The limestone for the exterior walls came from Indiana, shipped by rail in blocks weighing several tons each. Stonemasons, many of them trained in Europe, carved decorative details by hand: cornices, pediments, balustrades, each piece fitted with precision that bordered on obsession. The roof required thousands of slate tiles from Vermont, cut and shaped to overlap perfectly so that not a single drop of water would penetrate. The windows, over 200 of them, were custom-made, some with stained glass panels imported from France. Inside, the scale of the project became even more staggering. The grand staircase, the centerpiece of the entrance hall, was carved from Italian Carrara marble. Each step was a single slab, polished to a mirror finish. The banisters were bronze, cast in Philadelphia foundries, and then gilded with gold leaf. The ceiling above the staircase rose 3 stories, covered in ornamental plasterwork that depicted classical scenes: gods, nymphs, laurel wreaths, all sculpted by craftsmen who spent months on scaffolding, shaping wet plaster with tools no bigger than a pencil. The ballroom occupied the entire east wing of the mansion. It measured 60 feet by 90 feet, with a ceiling that soared 30 feet overhead. Crystal chandeliers, each weighing over a ton, hung from reinforced beams hidden above the plaster. The floor was parquet, assembled from rare woods: mahogany, walnut, rosewood, arranged in geometric patterns so intricate that guests would later spend entire evenings simply staring at it. The walls were paneled in French oak, each section fitted without visible nails or seams, creating the illusion that the room had been carved from a single piece of wood. The library on the opposite side of the house was Widener's personal sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined every wall, built to hold tens of thousands of volumes. A rolling ladder allowed access to the highest shelves. The fireplace was carved from a single block of limestone, with a mantel wide enough to display a dozen sculptures. Leather chairs, deep and soft, were arranged around Persian rugs that had once belonged to Ottoman princes. This was where Widener would spend his evenings, surrounded by books he would never have time to read, in a room designed to make him feel like a scholar, a gentleman, a man of culture and refinement. But the most revealing part of Lynnewood Hall was not the grand public spaces, it was the basement. Beneath the marble floors and gilded ceilings, an entire hidden city took shape. Kitchens sprawled across multiple rooms, equipped with coal-fired stoves, walk-in refrigerators, and sculleries where a small army of staff could prepare meals for hundreds of guests. Laundry rooms held industrial washing machines and drying racks that stretched from floor to ceiling. Storage vaults contained everything from china and silverware to linens and spare furniture. A wine cellar, temperature-controlled and humidity-regulated, held thousands of bottles, some dating back to the 1700s. The heating system alone required its own building, a boiler house located 100 yards from the main mansion, connected by underground tunnels. Coal was delivered by rail and stored in massive bins. Stokers worked in shifts, shoveling fuel into furnaces that kept the mansion at a comfortable temperature even in the coldest Pennsylvania winters. The system consumed several tons of coal every week during the winter months, and the cost of fuel alone ran into the tens of thousands of dollars annually. Electricity was still a novelty in the 1890s, and many wealthy families distrusted it, but Widener insisted on having it installed throughout Lynnewood Hall. A private power plant was built on the property, generating enough electricity not only for lighting, but also for elevators, ventilation fans, and a rudimentary intercom system that allowed the family to summon servants without ringing bells. The wiring was hidden inside the walls, running through conduits that had to be planned before the plaster went up. It was cutting-edge technology, expensive and complex, but Widener wanted the best. Water came from wells drilled deep into the property, pumped into storage tanks, and then distributed through a network of pipes that supplied every bathroom, kitchen, and fountain. The plumbing system included hot water heaters, something most American homes did not have until decades later. Guests at Lynnewood Hall could turn a tap and immediately receive steaming hot water, a luxury that in 1900 felt almost miraculous. The estate also required extensive landscaping. Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., son of the man who designed Central Park, was brought in to plan the gardens. He proposed a series of terraced lawns, formal flower beds, and tree-lined paths that would guide visitors through the property like scenes in a theatrical production. Greenhouses were constructed to grow orchids, roses, and tropical plants that could not survive Pennsylvania winters. Stables housed dozens of horses, along with carriages, sleighs, and eventually automobiles as they became fashionable. By 1900, Lynnewood Hall was largely complete. The final cost remains unclear. Some estimates place it at $8 million, others as high as $12 million. In today's dollars, adjusted for inflation and relative economic value, that translates to somewhere between $300 million and $500 million. It was, by any measure, one of the most expensive private residences ever built in the United States. Peter Widener walked through the finished rooms in the spring of 1900, accompanied by his wife Hannah and their 3 sons. The house gleamed. Every surface was perfect. Every detail reflected months, sometimes years of planning and execution. The ballroom waited for guests. The library waited for quiet evenings. The bedrooms waited for family gatherings that would span generations. Widener must have felt something close to triumph. He had done it. He had built his palace. He had proven that a butcher's son from Philadelphia could create something as magnificent as anything the old families owned. Lynnewood Hall was his answer to every snub, every closed door, every whispered comment about new money and social climbers. But the house was not finished. Not really. Because a house is not just walls and ceilings, it is the people who live in it, the routines that fill it, the memories that cling to it. And those things, the invisible architecture of daily life, were about to be tested in ways Peter Widener could never have imagined. The servants were already moving in, claiming their tiny rooms in the attic and basement. The staff hierarchy was being established, who reported to whom, who controlled which spaces, who had the authority to discipline and dismiss. The machinery of Gilded Age domestic life was gearing up, preparing to keep Lynnewood Hall running with the precision of a factory and the discretion of a secret society. And upstairs, in the grand bedrooms with their silk wallpaper and carved four-poster beds, Peter Widener's family was beginning to settle in. His sons were growing into adulthood, taking on roles in the family businesses, making their own fortunes, starting their own families. The future looked secure. The dynasty seemed inevitable. No one could have known that within 15 years, nearly everyone who mattered to Peter Widener would be dead, and Lynnewood Hall, the monument to permanence, would begin its long, slow transformation into a tomb.
Lynnewood Hall was not just a mansion, it was a small city, a self-contained world that required constant labor to maintain the illusion of effortless elegance. By 1901, the estate employed over 60 full-time staff members, and that number could swell to nearly 100 during the social season when the family hosted large gatherings and extended visits from out-of-town guests. Every person had a defined role, a place in a hierarchy as rigid and formal as any military organization. At the top stood the butler, a man named Thomas Brennan, who had been hired away from a British aristocratic household with promises of better wages and more authority. Brennan controlled the male staff, footmen, valets, chauffeurs, and the small army of groundskeepers who kept the lawns perfect and the gardens blooming. He reported directly to Peter Widener, but in practice, he ran the day-to-day operations of the mansion with almost complete autonomy. The housekeeper, Mrs. Adelaide Foster, controlled the female staff, maids, laundresses, kitchen workers, and seamstresses. She reported to Hannah Widener, but like Brennan, she wielded enormous power within her domain. Mrs. Foster conducted inspections every morning, running white-gloved fingers along banisters and windowsills, checking for dust that was invisible to the naked eye. A single speck could result in a scolding. Repeated failures could mean dismissal without references, which in the world of domestic service was a death sentence. Beneath them, the staff divided into specialized roles. The lady's maid, assigned exclusively to Hannah Widener, helped her dress, styled her hair, maintained her wardrobe, and accompanied her on trips. The valet performed similar duties for Peter Widener, along with managing his extensive collection of suits, shoes, and accessories. Footmen served meals, answered doors, carried messages, and stood at attention during formal dinners, often for hours without moving. Parlor maids cleaned the public rooms, polished silver, and arranged flowers. Chambermaids handled the bedrooms, emptying chamber pots. Even though the house had modern plumbing, some family members preferred the old ways, making beds with hospital corner precision and ensuring that fresh linens appeared as if by magic. The kitchen staff worked in a separate universe. The head chef, a Frenchman named Auguste Moreau, commanded a brigade of sous chefs, pastry chefs, and kitchen assistants. Moreau had trained in Paris and served in several aristocratic households before Widener lured him to Pennsylvania with an extravagant salary. He demanded perfection and ran his kitchen like a battlefield. Meals were planned days in advance, with menus written in French and approved by Hannah Widener. A typical formal dinner included 7 to 10 courses: oysters, soup, fish, entree, roast, salad, dessert, cheese, fruit, each dish prepared with ingredients sourced from around the world. Terrapin shipped live from Maryland, foie gras imported from France, champagne from Reims, caviar from Russia. The kitchen operated on a brutal schedule. Staff arrived before dawn to begin prep work. Bread was baked fresh every morning. Vegetables were cleaned and chopped. Stocks simmered for hours. By mid-morning, the pace accelerated. Lunch service began at 1 o'clock, requiring precise timing to ensure that each course arrived at the table at the perfect temperature. Afternoons brought tea service, which seemed simple but demanded its own intricate choreography. Delicate sandwiches, scones, pastries, all arranged on tiered silver trays. Dinner preparation began in the late afternoon and could stretch past midnight if the family entertained guests. The heat in the kitchen was unbearable. Coal-fired stoves radiated waves of suffocating air. In summer, the temperature regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Workers fainted from heat exhaustion. Burns were common: scalding water, hot pans, open flames. The noise was constant: pots clanging, knives chopping, Moreau shouting orders in French accented English that many of the staff barely understood. Yet mistakes were unacceptable. A soufflé that fell, a sauce that broke, a roast that was overcooked, these were not minor errors, they were failures that reflected on the entire household, on the Widener name itself. Moreau fired kitchen staff regularly, sometimes for offenses as small as using the wrong knife or failing to wipe down a cutting board immediately after use. The laundry alone required a team of 6 women working full-time. Every tablecloth, napkin, sheet, towel, and article of clothing had to be washed, dried, ironed, and folded. The family changed clothes multiple times a day: morning dress, afternoon dress, evening dress, night clothes, and each outfit generated laundry. Formal dinners required fresh linens for every guest, sometimes 20 or 30 table settings, each with multiple napkins, tablecloths, and decorative runners. The laundresses worked in a basement room filled with steam from massive copper boilers. They scrubbed stains by hand, using harsh lye soap that ate through their skin. Their hands were red, cracked, and permanently swollen. Outside, the groundskeepers fought a never-ending battle against nature. The lawns had to be mowed with push mowers, a task that took an entire day even with multiple workers. Hedges had to be trimmed by hand, shaped into precise geometric forms. Flower beds had to be weeded, watered, and replanted seasonally. The greenhouses required constant monitoring: temperature, humidity, pest control. A single night of frost could destroy thousands of dollars worth of orchids. The stables housed not only horses, but also the carriages, harnesses, and tack that required daily cleaning and maintenance. Grooms woke before sunrise to feed and exercise the horses. Stalls had to be mucked out, fresh hay laid down, water troughs refilled. Later, when automobiles became popular, the stables expanded to include a garage with its own mechanics who serviced the family's growing fleet of cars. Beneath all of this, in the deepest parts of the basement, men worked in the mechanical rooms. They shoveled coal into the furnaces, monitored steam pressure, repaired pipes, replaced fuses, and kept the electrical generators running. These men were invisible to the family. They entered through separate doors, used separate staircases, and were instructed never to be seen in the main parts of the house. Their work was essential, but it was also shameful, dirty, physical, beneath the notice of people who lived upstairs. The wages varied wildly depending on position. The butler and housekeeper earned respectable salaries, enough to support families and save for retirement. Skilled workers like the chef commanded even higher pay. But the lower-tier staff, the scullery maids, the laundresses, the coal stokers, earned barely enough to survive. Room and board were provided, which kept them dependent on the estate. Leaving meant finding new employment without references, which in the tightly controlled world of domestic service was a death sentence. The hours were long. Most staff worked 6 days a week, with only Sunday afternoons off. During social events, those hours stretched even longer. A major dinner party could mean 16-hour shifts. The annual Widener Ball, held every spring, required days of preparation and left the entire staff exhausted. Yet there was a strange pride in working at Lynnewood Hall. It was one of the grandest estates in America. To be employed there meant something. It meant you were good enough to meet the exacting standards of the Widener family. It meant you were part of an institution, a machine that operated with precision and purpose. Former staff members would spend the rest of their lives talking about their time at Lynnewood Hall, dropping the name into conversations like a credential. But the machine required obedience. It required silence. The staff saw everything: family arguments, private scandals, moments of weakness and vulnerability. They overheard conversations that could ruin reputations. They knew which guests were having affairs, which family members drank too much, which business deals were made behind closed doors, and they were expected to say nothing. Discretion was not just a preference, it was a condition of employment. Peter Widener rarely interacted directly with the lower-tier staff. He knew the butler and the housekeeper by name, occasionally spoke with the chef, but the maids and footmen were largely invisible to him. They were part of the background, like the furniture or the wallpaper. This was normal for the time. Rich families did not see domestic workers as individuals. They were functions, roles, pieces in a complex system that allowed the family to live in comfort and elegance. Hannah Widener was more involved, particularly with the female staff. She conducted weekly meetings with Mrs. Foster, reviewed menus with the chef, and occasionally inspected the work of the chambermaids. But even her interactions were formal, distant. She did not ask about their families, their hopes, their struggles. That would have been inappropriate, a blurring of boundaries that both sides understood must remain firm. The children, George, Joseph, and Harry, grew up in this environment, surrounded by servants who catered to their every need. They never made their own beds, never cooked their own meals, never cleaned their own rooms. Footmen laid out their clothes each morning, maids drew their baths, chauffeurs drove them to school and social events. This was not seen as spoiling them, it was simply how wealthy children were raised. They were being prepared for lives of leisure and authority, lives in which other people would always handle the mundane details. By 1905, Lynnewood Hall had settled into a rhythm. The machinery hummed along, invisible and efficient. The family lived upstairs in luxury. The staff lived downstairs in service. The house itself stood as a monument to wealth, taste, and ambition. But the machinery was fragile. It depended on money flowing in steadily, on social structures remaining stable, and on the family staying intact. And all of those things, money, stability, family, were about to be tested in ways that no amount of marble or gold leaf could protect against. The first crack appeared in 1912, and it would shatter everything. April 15, 1912, North Atlantic Ocean, 2:20 a.m. The RMS Titanic broke apart and sank beneath the black water, taking 1,517 souls with it. Among the dead was George Widener, 49 years old, traveling first class with his wife Eleanor and their son Harry. Also lost was Harry Widener, 27 years old,
a Harvard graduate and passionate bibliophile who had spent the voyage in Europe acquiring rare books for his growing collection. They had been returning from a book-buying trip in London and Paris. Harry had successfully bid on a rare 1958 edition of Francis Bacon's essays at a London auction, a treasure he planned to add to the library at Lynnewood Hall. On the night the ship struck the iceberg, Harry reportedly went back to his cabin to retrieve the book. He was never seen alive again. George Widener also perished. Witnesses later reported seeing him helping women and children into lifeboats, maintaining the composure expected of a gentleman even as the ship tilted and the water rose. He did not survive. Eleanor Widener did. She made it into one of the lifeboats and was rescued by the Carpathia hours later. When she arrived in New York several days after the sinking, she was wrapped in borrowed clothes, her face blank with shock. The telegram had already reached Philadelphia. Peter Widener received the news at Lynnewood Hall on the morning of April 16th. His son and grandson were dead. What followed was not dramatic in the theatrical sense. There were no screaming breakdowns, no public displays of grief. The Wideners were old money now, or at least they pretended to be, and old money did not fall apart in public. The family issued brief statements to the press. Memorial services were held. Black wreaths appeared on the doors of Lynnewood Hall. But inside the mansion, something fundamental broke. Peter Widener was 77 years old. He had built an empire, assembled one of the greatest art collections in America, and constructed a palace meant to house generations of his family. All of it had been built on the assumption that his children would outlive him, that the dynasty would continue, that the name Widener would endure. George had been his heir, the son groomed to take over the businesses, to maintain the fortune, to preserve the legacy. Harry, George's son, had been the next generation, a young man of taste and education who could carry the family into the future. Now both were gone, drowned in the Atlantic, their bodies never recovered. Peter's remaining sons, Joseph and Harry Elkins Widener, named after Peter's business partner, were still alive, but the loss of George and young Harry was not something that could be replaced or repaired. It was a wound that went deeper than grief. It was the shattering of the entire purpose behind Lynnewood Hall. Eleanor Widener, the survivor, returned to Philadelphia a changed woman. She would never fully recover from the trauma of that night, the screams, the cold, the slow realization that her husband and son were not coming back. She moved into Lynnewood Hall with Peter and Hannah, occupying rooms on the second floor that overlooked the gardens. She rarely left. She rarely spoke.
The staff learned to move around her silently as if she were a ghost haunting her own life. Peter withdrew into the library. He spent hours there, sitting in one of the leather chairs, staring at the shelves of books that his grandson had loved. The rare Bacon volume Harry had died trying to save was never found. It went down with the ship, along with hundreds of other books Harry had purchased on that final trip. Peter tried to maintain normalcy. She continued to host dinners, to manage the household, to supervise the staff, but the energy was gone. The parties felt hollow. Guests came out of obligation, not enthusiasm. The ballroom, which had once hosted thousands, sat empty more often than not. The chandeliers gathered dust. The staff noticed the change immediately. The house became quieter. The laughter that had once echoed through the halls disappeared. Meals were smaller, simpler. The elaborate multi-course dinners ceased. Peter ate little and often skipped meals entirely. Hannah moved through the rooms like a woman trying to remember why she was there. Mrs. Foster, the housekeeper, began letting staff go, not all at once, but gradually, as it became clear that the family no longer needed a full complement of servants. The social calendar had collapsed. There were no more balls, no more weekend house parties, no more visiting dignitaries. The footmen who had once stood at attention in the entrance hall were dismissed. Several of the chambermaids were let go. The kitchen staff was cut nearly in half. The ones who remained felt the weight of the silence. They had worked in a house filled with life, movement, and purpose. Now they worked in a mausoleum. They cleaned rooms no one entered. They polished silver no one used. They maintained a house that no longer functioned as a home. Peter Widener tried to honor his grandson's memory by donating young Harry's book collection to Harvard University. The university gratefully accepted and built a library in Harry's name, the Harry E. Elkins Widener Memorial Library, which still stands today as one of the largest academic libraries in the world. Peter funded the entire construction, pouring money into a monument that would preserve his grandson's love of books. But the library was in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It was not at Lynnewood Hall. It could not fill the empty rooms or bring back the voices that were gone. In 1914, Eleanor Widener died. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but those close to the family believed she had simply given up. She was 73 years old and had spent the last 2 years watching her husband fade into silence. The grief had consumed her slowly, like a disease with no cure. Peter was now alone. His sons Joseph and Harry Elkins Widener still visited, but they had their own lives, their own families. Lynnewood Hall, the palace built to house generations, was now occupied by a single old man and the staff required to keep him alive. He wandered the house at night, according to servants who later recounted those years. They would hear his footsteps on the marble floors, echoing through empty hallways. He walked through the ballroom, past the library, up the grand staircase. Sometimes he stopped in front of portraits of George and young Harry. Sometimes he sat in the library until dawn, surrounded by books, saying nothing. The maintenance of the estate became a burden. The costs did not decrease just because the family had shrunk. The furnaces still needed coal, the roof still needed repairs, the staff still required wages, the property taxes were enormous, the upkeep of the gardens, the stables, the greenhouses, all of it continued to drain money at an astonishing rate. Peter's fortune was still vast, but he had lost the will to engage with it. He stopped attending board meetings. He delegated more and more authority to his remaining sons and to trusted business managers. The empire he had built continued to generate wealth, but he no longer cared about expansion or acquisition. He had spent his life accumulating, and now he understood that none of it mattered. The art collection, which had once been a source of pride, now felt like a rebuke. The Rembrandts and Raphaels hung on the walls, beautiful and lifeless. They had not saved his son. They had not prevented the Titanic from sinking. They were just objects, expensive and meaningless.
In 1915, Peter Widener began making arrangements to donate much of his art collection to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., which was still in the planning stages. He wanted the paintings to be seen, to be appreciated by people who might actually care about them. He no longer wanted them in his house, reminders of a life that had been built on the assumption that beauty and wealth could create permanence. The staff watched all of this unfold with a mixture of pity and unease. They had signed on to work in one of America's grandest estates, a symbol of success and ambition. Now they were maintaining a tomb, polishing silver for a man who barely noticed them, preparing meals for a household that had collapsed into silence. Some of the older staff members, the ones who had been there since the beginning, began to whisper among themselves. Lynnewood Hall was cursed, they said. The house had been built on ambition and pride, and now it was paying the price. The Titanic had taken the future, and what remained was just a shell, beautiful on the outside, but hollow within. Peter Widener did not believe in curses. He believed in money, in hard work, in the idea that a man could shape his own destiny. But even he could not ignore the cruelty of what had happened. He had spent millions building a palace to secure his family's future, and the future drowned in the North Atlantic. On November 6, 1915, Peter Errol Brown Widener died at Lynnewood Hall. He was 83 years old. The official cause of death was pneumonia, but in truth, he had been dying slowly since 1912. The grief had simply taken 3 years to finish the job. His funeral was held in the ballroom, the same room where he had once hosted 1,000 guests. Now it held a few dozen mourners, family, close friends, business associates. The chandeliers blazed overhead, illuminating a casket draped in black cloth. The service was brief and formal. Peter Widener had never been a man for sentiment, and his funeral reflected that. He was buried in the family mausoleum, alongside Hannah and near the memorial markers for George and young Harry, whose bodies had never been recovered. Lynnewood Hall passed to his surviving sons, Joseph and Harry Elkins Widener. They inherited not just the mansion, but also the crushing weight of maintaining it, and neither of them wanted it.
Joseph Widener had no interest in living at Lynnewood Hall. He had his own estate, his own life, his own vision of what wealth should look like. He was a horseman, a sportsman, a man who preferred the racetrack to the library. The enormous Georgian palace in Elkins Park felt like a monument to grief, and he wanted nothing to do with it. Harry Elkins Widener, not to be confused with his nephew who died on the Titanic, felt differently. He was the younger son, quieter, more introspective, and perhaps more bound by duty. He understood that someone had to take responsibility for their father's creation. Someone had to keep Lynnewood Hall alive, even if it no longer served any real purpose. So, in 1915, after Peter's death, Harry Elkins Widener became the reluctant steward of the mansion. He moved in with his wife, Edith, and their children, occupying the same rooms his parents had used. He inherited not just the house, but also the art collection, the furnishings, the staff, and the staggering financial burden of keeping it all running. The numbers were brutal. Lynnewood Hall cost an estimated $100,000 per year to maintain in 1915 dollars, roughly $3 million annually in today's money. That figure included property taxes, staff salaries, utilities, coal for heating, repairs, groundskeeping, and general upkeep, and that was just to keep the house functional. Any significant repairs, a new roof, updated plumbing, structural reinforcement, could easily add tens of thousands more. Harry Elkins Widener could afford it. He had inherited a substantial portion of his father's fortune, and the family businesses continued to generate income. But affordability was not the same as sustainability. The world was changing. The Gilded Age was dying, and the idea that one family needed 110 rooms, 60 servants, and 480 acres of manicured grounds was beginning to look not just extravagant, but absurd. The staff that remained after Peter's death tried to maintain standards. Mrs. Foster, now in her 60s, still conducted her morning inspections. Thomas Brennan, the butler, still enforced the rules of service with military precision. But the energy was different. They were no longer serving a thriving household. They were preserving a museum, polishing artifacts that no one looked at, preparing rooms that no one used. Harry and Edith Widener did try to bring some life back to the mansion. They hosted occasional dinners, invited family for holidays, opened parts of the house for charity events, but these efforts felt forced. Performances staged in a theater that had lost its audience. The ballroom that had once held 1,000 guests now hosted gatherings of 20 or 30. The dining room that could seat 50 served meals for 6 or 8. The vast majority of Lynnewood Hall sat empty, silent, waiting for a purpose that would never return. The children, Harry and Edith had 3, grew up in a house that felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by the weight of history. They played in the same gardens where their grandfather had walked, climbed the same marble staircase, explored the same endless hallways. But they also sensed the sadness embedded in the walls. They heard the stories about the Titanic, about Uncle George and Cousin Harry, about how the house had been built for a future that never arrived. The staff's relationship with the family became increasingly strained. In Peter Widener's day, there had been a clear understanding. The family provided employment and security, and the staff provided service and discretion. It was transactional, but stable. Now, with the household shrinking and the social relevance of the estate fading, the arrangement felt more precarious. Wages stagnated. Mrs. Foster fought repeatedly with Harry Widener over the household budget, arguing that staff deserved raises after years of loyal service. Harry, conscious of the enormous costs already eating into the family fortune, refused. Several longtime employees quit in frustration. Finding replacements became difficult. Young people no longer wanted to enter domestic service, especially not in a dying mansion miles from the city. By the early 1920s, the staff had been cut to fewer than 30 people. Entire wings of the house were closed off, their furniture covered with sheets, their windows shuttered. The greenhouses, once filled with exotic orchids and tropical plants, were mostly abandoned. The stables, which had housed dozens of horses, were sold off along with the animals. The private railway siding, which had once brought coal and supplies directly to the estate, was torn up and the tracks were removed. Harry Widener made one significant addition to the property during his tenure. He expanded the art collection. Like his father, he was a collector, though his tastes ran more toward European masterworks than American pieces. He purchased paintings by Vermeer, Titian, and El Greco, adding them to the Rembrandts and Raphaels already hanging in the mansion. The gallery at Lynnewood Hall became one of the finest private collections in the world, rivaling those of the Frick family and the Mellons. But the collection also became a problem. The more valuable the art, the more security it required. Insurance costs skyrocketed. The family hired guards to patrol the property at night. Alarm systems were installed. Primitive by modern standards, but cutting edge for the 1920s. The house that had once been a symbol of openness and hospitality became a fortress, its gates locked, its windows watched. Harry Widener also faced pressure from museums and cultural institutions. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the National Gallery in Washington, all of them approached him with offers, suggestions, and sometimes outright pleas to donate or loan parts of the collection. They argued that art of this caliber should be accessible to the public, not locked away in a private mansion where only a handful of people could see it. Harry resisted. It was his father's legacy, his family's heritage. Giving it away felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that Lynnewood Hall had failed in its purpose. So he stayed. He continued to pay the bills, to employ the shrinking staff, to maintain the gardens and the buildings. He continued to live in a handful of rooms while the rest of the mansion slowly deteriorated. Plaster cracked, paint peeled, leaks appeared in the roof. The marble floors, once polished daily, grew dull. The fountains in the garden stopped working, their pumps broken and never repaired. The staff who remained grew older. Mrs. Foster, the housekeeper, retired in 1932. Thomas Brennan, the butler, died in 1935. They were not replaced. The new generation of workers was younger, less trained, less committed to the old standards. They did their jobs, but they did not care about Lynnewood Hall the way the original staff had. It was just a job, not a calling. Harry's health began to fail in the late 1930s. He developed heart problems, exacerbated by stress and the weight of maintaining the estate. His doctors advised him to slow down, to reduce his responsibilities, but he could not. He was the last guardian of his father's dream, and he would not abandon his post. On October 26, 1942, Harry Elkins Widener died at Lynnewood Hall. He was 71 years old. His death marked the end of an era. For the first time since its construction, the mansion had no Widener living in it. The family gathered to discuss what to do with the property, but no one wanted it, not as a residence anyway. The house that Peter Widener had built to last forever had survived only 27 years as a functioning family home. Now it sat empty, filled with priceless art and priceless memories, waiting for someone to decide its fate. The decision, when it finally came, would shock the art world and break the heart of everyone who had ever loved Lynnewood Hall. December 1942. Lynnewood Hall stood silent. No smoke rose from the chimneys. No lights glowed in the windows. The staff had been dismissed, given severance pay and letters of reference, then sent away to find new positions in a world that no longer had much use for trained domestic servants. The greenhouses, untended, began to surrender to weeds. The fountains stood dry. The greenhouses, their glass panels cracked and broken, sheltered nothing but dead plants and rotting soil. Inside, the house waited. The grand staircase still gleamed, though dust had begun to settle on the marble. The ballroom stood empty, its chandeliers dark. The library, filled with thousands of books, smelled of old paper and leather. The paintings, Rembrandt, Raphael, Vermeer, Van Dyck, hung on the walls in silent galleries, watched over by no one. The Widener family had a decision to make, and they made it quickly. None of them wanted to live in the mansion. The cost of maintaining it was staggering, and the cultural moment had passed. Gilded Age palaces were no longer symbols of success. They were embarrassments, monuments to excess in a world struggling through a global war and still recovering from economic collapse. So they decided to dismantle Peter Widener's dream piece by piece. The art collection came first. Harry Elkins Widener's will had stipulated that portions of the collection should go to specific institutions. The National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., which Peter Widener had helped fund, received an extraordinary bequest. Paintings of Raphael, Titian, El Greco, Vermeer, and Van Dyck. These works, valued even then in millions of dollars, became the core of the National Gallery's European collection. Today, they are considered some of the most important paintings in American public collections. Other pieces went to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, to Harvard in memory of young Harry who died on the Titanic, and to a handful of other institutions. But not everything was donated. Some of the family kept favorite pieces, some were sold privately to collectors, and some simply disappeared, their fates lost to history. By early 1943, the walls of Lynnewood Hall were bare. Rectangular shadows marked where paintings had hung for decades. The galleries, once filled with masterpieces, now displayed only empty frames and the ghosts of what had been. Next came the furnishings. In the spring of 1943, the family hired the prestigious auction house Parker Burnett Galleries to liquidate the contents of the mansion. Advertisements appeared in newspapers across the country. The Widener collection, fine furniture, decorative arts, and antiquities from Lynnewood Hall. Collectors, dealers, and curiosity seekers descended on Elkins Park for a series of auctions that lasted several weeks. Everything was for sale. The Italian marble mantels carved by hand in the 1890s, the French oak paneling from the library, the crystal chandeliers that had illuminated 1,000 dinner parties, the Persian rugs that had been walked on by presidents, industrialists, and European nobility. The
the dining room table that could seat 50, the leather chairs from Peter Widener's study, the silver, the china, the linens, every physical object that had made Lynnewood Hall a home. Bidders filled the ballroom, sitting in folding chairs brought in for the occasion. The auctioneer's voice echoed off the walls as lot after lot went under the hammer. A Chippendale desk sold for $3,000. A set of Louis XV chairs brought $5,000. A chandelier from the entrance hall fetched $8,000. These were substantial sums in 1943, but they were nothing compared to what the items had cost to acquire or what they would be worth today. The atmosphere during the auctions was strange, almost ghoulish. People wandered through the mansion, inspecting items tagged with lot numbers, running their hands over furniture that had been crafted by European masters. Some buyers were genuine collectors, hoping to acquire pieces of museum quality. Others were dealers looking to flip items for profit. And some were simply scavengers, picking through the remains of a dead dynasty. The staff members who had worked at Lynnewood Hall heard about the auctions, and a few attended. They walked through rooms they had cleaned thousands of times, now stripped and empty. They saw strangers handling objects they had polished, furniture they had dusted, silver they had served meals on. It felt like watching a loved one's body being dissected. Mrs. Foster, the former housekeeper, came to one of the final auction days. She was in her 70s by then, retired and living in a small apartment in Philadelphia. She stood in the ballroom, watching as the last lots were sold, and reportedly wept. A reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer approached her and asked her if she had any memories of the house. She shook her head and walked away without speaking. By June 1943, Lynnewood Hall was empty. Every stick of furniture, every painting, every decorative object had been removed. The mansion was now just a shell, walls, floors, and ceilings, but no soul. The family had extracted everything of value, leaving behind only the architecture itself. And the architecture, it turned out, had no buyers. The Widener family tried to sell the property. They hired real estate agents, placed advertisements, entertained offers, but no one wanted it. The mansion was too large, too expensive to maintain, too far from the city center to be practical as a business or institutional building. The 480 acres were valuable for development, but the mansion itself was a liability. Developers who looked at the property calculated that it would be cheaper to demolish the house than to renovate it. The family briefly considered donating Lynnewood Hall to a university or museum. Temple University, located nearby, was approached. So was the Catholic Archdiocese of Philadelphia. Both expressed mild interest but ultimately declined. The operational costs were simply too high. No institution wanted to take on the financial burden of maintaining a 110-room mansion. So Lynnewood Hall sat empty. The family continued to pay property taxes and minimal maintenance costs, enough to keep the roof from collapsing, enough to prevent total vandalism, but nothing more. The estate became a holding pattern, a problem deferred but not solved. During World War II, there was brief discussion about converting the mansion into a military hospital or a training facility. Government officials toured the property, took measurements, made plans, but the logistics proved too complicated. The house was designed for elegance, not efficiency. The hallways were too narrow for hospital beds. The rooms were too formal for barracks. The heating system was outdated and expensive to run. In the end, the military lost interest and looked elsewhere. After the war, the property remained in limbo. The Widener family sold off portions of the land, subdividing the 480 acres into smaller parcels. Developers bought the farmland and began constructing middle-class neighborhoods. Streets were laid out, sewers installed, power lines strung. The grand estate that had once been isolated from the world was now surrounded by middle-class neighborhoods. But the mansion itself stayed untouched, a decaying monument at the center of an expanding suburb. The gates remained locked, the windows were boarded up. The gardens, once pride of Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., reverted to wilderness. Trees that had been carefully shaped and trimmed grew wild. Flower beds disappeared under weeds and brambles.
the reflecting pools filled with algae and debris. Local children began to tell stories about the abandoned mansion. They claimed it was haunted, that you could see lights in the windows at night, that strange sounds echoed from inside. Teenagers, drawn by the allure of the forbidden, broke through the fences and explored the empty rooms. They left behind graffiti, broken bottles, and trash. Security patrols occasionally chased them off, but the vandalism continued. By the 1950s, Lynnewood Hall had become a local embarrassment. Newspapers ran articles with headlines like "Widener Mansion Continues to Decay" and "What Will Become of Elkins Park's Ghost Palace." Residents complained that the property was an eyesore, that it attracted vandals and lowered property values. The township considered legal action to force the Widener family to either restore the building or demolish it. The family did neither. They simply waited, hoping that someone somewhere would see value in the property and take it off their hands. That someone finally appeared in 1952. His name was Franz Groll, and he was not interested in preserving Peter Widener's dream. He was interested in money.
Franz Groll was a developer, a businessman who saw opportunity where others saw problems. When he purchased Lynnewood Hall in 1952 for approximately $90,000, a fraction of what it had cost to build, he had no sentimental attachment to the Widener name or the Gilded Age ideals the mansion represented. He saw 110 rooms, valuable architectural materials, and land that could be leveraged. His first plan was straightforward: convert the mansion into a luxury apartment building. The logic seemed sound. Post-war America was experiencing a housing boom. Veterans were returning, starting families, looking for places to live. Lynnewood Hall, properly subdivided, could house dozens of families. The grand public rooms could be converted into common areas. The bedrooms could become individual apartments. The grounds could provide parking and recreation space. Groll hired architects to draw up plans. He applied for zoning variances from the township. He placed advertisements in newspapers, seeking investors to help fund the conversion. The project, he estimated, would cost roughly $500,000, a substantial sum, but potentially profitable if the apartments could be rented at premium rates. The township denied his zoning request. Local residents, many of them living in the houses that had been built on subdivided Widener land, did not want their neighborhood turned into a high-density apartment complex. They organized opposition, attended township meetings, and argued that the conversion would bring traffic, noise, and an influx of renters who would not care about property values the way homeowners did. The township board, responding to voter pressure, ruled that the mansion could not be converted without community approval. Groll did not give up. He proposed a second plan: turn Lynnewood Hall into a private school. Several boarding schools and preparatory academies were expanding in the 1950s, and a mansion with over 100 rooms seemed ideal for classrooms, dormitories, and administrative offices. Groll approached several educational institutions, pitching the property as a ready-made campus. Again, he found no takers. The schools that looked at Lynnewood Hall reached the same conclusion everyone else had: the building was too expensive to operate. The heating system alone would consume a fortune in fuel. The plumbing needed extensive updates. The electrical wiring, installed in the 1890s, was dangerously outdated. Bringing the mansion up to code for institutional use would cost more than building a new facility from scratch. Groll tried a third approach. He offered Lynnewood Hall to the Catholic Church. The Archdiocese of Philadelphia was expanding its network of schools, hospitals, and retreat centers. Surely, Groll reasoned, the church could find a use for such a magnificent building. The church declined. The same financial realities applied. Operating costs were prohibitive, and the church was not in the business of maintaining architectural monuments for their own sake. By 1954, Groll was growing desperate. He had sunk money into property taxes, minimal maintenance, and legal fees fighting the township. The mansion was not generating any income, and his investors were growing impatient. He began stripping the property of anything valuable that remained. The marble mantels, which had survived the 1943 auctions because they were built into the walls, were pried out and sold to salvage dealers. Sections of oak paneling from the library were removed and resold to collectors. Light fixtures, doorknobs, brass hardware, anything that could be removed without collapsing the structure was taken and sold. Groll was not restoring Lynnewood Hall. He was harvesting it.
The local newspapers covered the dismantling with a mixture of outrage and resignation. Editorials lamented the loss of a historic landmark. Preservationists argued that Lynnewood Hall should be protected, designated as a cultural treasure. But no one stepped forward with the money necessary to save it. Historic preservation as a movement was still in its infancy in the 1950s. The concept that old buildings had intrinsic value regardless of their current utility had not yet taken hold in American culture. Grohl finally gave up in 1956. He sold Lynnewood Hall to a consortium of investors for approximately $50,000, less than he had paid for it. He walked away from the project, having lost money and years of effort. The new owners, a group of businessmen with no clear plan, essentially parked the property and waited for market conditions to improve. The mansion continued to decay. The roof, no longer maintained, began to leak in multiple places. Water seeped into the upper floors, staining ceilings and warping floorboards. In winter, pipes froze and burst, flooding rooms with icy water that pooled on the marble floors. The damage was cumulative, relentless. Every season brought new destruction. Vandalism increased. The boarded-up windows were pried open. Trespassers explored the empty rooms, leaving behind graffiti that covered the walls in layers. Obscene slogans, names, dates, gang symbols. Some vandals built fires in the fireplaces, scorching the carved surrounds. Others smashed whatever they could: windows, plaster moldings, bathroom fixtures. It was destruction for its own sake, the kind of mindless violence that happens when a place loses all authority and becomes fair game. The basement flooded repeatedly. The boiler system, which had once heated the entire mansion, rusted and collapsed. Mold spread through the lower levels, climbing walls and seeping into wooden beams. The smell became overwhelming: damp rot, mildew, decay. Anyone who entered the mansion described it as breathing in death. Yet Lynnewood Hall refused to die completely. The limestone exterior, built to last centuries, held firm. The marble staircase, though stained and cracked, still stood. The ballroom, stripped of its chandeliers and furniture, remained structurally sound. The house was wounded but not destroyed. In the 1960s, another developer tried again. His plan was to demolish Lynnewood Hall and build a shopping center on the land. The mansion, he argued, was beyond saving. The only rational choice was to tear it down and start fresh. He applied for demolition permits and began lining up contractors. This time, the opposition was louder. A coalition of preservationists, historians, and local residents organized protests. They argued that Lynnewood Hall was a piece of American history, a monument to the Gilded Age that deserved protection. They contacted the National Trust for Historic Preservation, seeking federal intervention. They wrote letters to newspapers, appeared on local television programs, and lobbied elected officials. The township, caught between developers and preservationists, hesitated. Demolition permits were delayed, then denied pending further review. The developer, frustrated by the bureaucratic obstacles, eventually abandoned the project. Lynnewood Hall survived, but only barely. In the 1970s brought a brief moment of hope. A nonprofit organization called the Friends of Lynnewood Hall was formed with the goal of restoring the mansion and converting it into a museum. They raised modest funds, conducted architectural surveys, and developed restoration plans. For a few months, it seemed like Lynnewood Hall might finally find salvation. But the numbers didn't work. The restoration would cost an estimated $5 million at minimum, probably closer to $10 million once all the damage was properly assessed. The nonprofit could raise donations in the tens of thousands, maybe eventually the hundreds of thousands, but they were nowhere close to the millions needed. Without major financial backing from the government, a wealthy donor, or a corporate sponsor, the project was doomed. The Friends of Lynnewood Hall disbanded in 1978. Their final report, filed with the State Historical Commission, concluded that the mansion was architecturally significant but financially unsalvageable. It was a death certificate written in bureaucratic language. Through all of this, the mansion continued to stand, stripped, vandalized, rotting from the inside out, but standing. It had become a paradox, too important to destroy, too expensive to save. A monument frozen in decay, waiting for a future that might never come. The property changed hands several more times in the 1980s and 1990s. Each new owner arrived with optimism and plans. Each eventually walked away defeated. One proposed turning it into a wedding venue, another suggested a bed and breakfast, a third floated the idea of luxury condominiums within the existing structure. None of these plans materialized. The fundamental problem remained unchanged. Lynnewood Hall was too big, too damaged, and too expensive. By the year 2000, the mansion had been abandoned for nearly 60 years. An entire generation had grown up in Elkins Park, knowing Lynnewood Hall only as a ruin, a haunted house, a local legend. Parents warned their children to stay away. Police regularly chased trespassers off the property. Neighbors complained about the eyesore at the center of their community. Yet still, the house stood. And then, in 2012, exactly 100 years after the Titanic sank and shattered the Widener family, someone finally stepped forward with the money and determination to try one more time. His name was Richard Yoon, and in 2012, he did something that everyone said was impossible. He bought Lynnewood Hall. Not just the land, not just the development rights, but the mansion itself. All 110 rooms, 70,000 square feet of decaying grandeur for approximately $16 million. Yoon was not a preservationist. He was not a historian with a romantic attachment to the Gilded Age. He was a businessman, a developer who had made his fortune in healthcare and real estate. He saw Lynnewood Hall the way Peter Widener had once seen a muddy hillside in Elkins Park, as raw potential, a problem that could be solved with enough money and determination. But unlike the previous owners who had tried to convert, subdivide, or demolish the property, Yoon announced something different. He was going to restore Lynnewood Hall, completely. He would bring it back to its original glory, repair every crack, replace every broken window, restore every damaged surface, and when he was done, he would live there. The announcement was met with skepticism bordering on disbelief. Architectural experts estimated that a full restoration would cost between $30 and $50 million, possibly more once all the hidden damage was uncovered. The mansion had been deteriorating for 70 years. Water damage alone had compromised structural elements throughout the building. The heating, plumbing, and electrical systems would need to be completely replaced. The roof was failing. The windows were broken. Mold infested the basement and climbed into the upper floors. Yoon was undeterred. He hired structural engineers to assess the building. He brought in architects to develop restoration plans. He consulted with historical preservation experts to ensure that repairs would be historically accurate, and he began spending money. The first priority was stabilization. Before any restoration could begin, the building had to be secured against further decay. Contractors installed temporary supports to shore up sagging floors. The roof was covered with tarps to prevent additional water intrusion. Broken windows were boarded up properly, not the half-hearted plywood patches that had been there for decades, but professional enclosures that kept out weather and vandals. Security systems were installed, and guards were hired to patrol the property 24 hours a day. For the first time in 70 years, Lynnewood Hall had an owner who was actively protecting it. The work moved slowly. Each room revealed new problems. Ceilings that looked intact were actually held up by rot and inertia. Walls that appeared solid crumbled when touched. The grand staircase, Lynnewood Hall's most iconic feature, had cracks in the marble that threatened the entire structure. Repairing it would require disassembling the staircase piece by piece, restoring each slab, and then reconstructing it. Yoon hired master craftsmen, stonemasons, plasterers, carpenters, many of them trained in Europe, where traditional restoration techniques were still practiced. These were not ordinary construction workers. They were artists, specialists who understood historical materials and methods. They worked with hand tools, mixing plaster the way it had been mixed in the 1890s, carving replacement moldings to match surviving originals, sourcing materials that were no longer commercially available. The basement was gutted. Decades of mold were scraped away, contaminated materials removed, and the entire space treated with industrial-grade antimicrobial solutions. New mechanical systems were installed, modern boilers, updated electrical panels, contemporary plumbing that met current building codes while remaining invisible within the historical fabric of the house. The ballroom, once the crown jewel of Lynnewood Hall, required painstaking restoration. The plaster ceiling, covered in ornamental details, had water damage and cracks throughout. Restoration specialists spent months on scaffolding, carefully repairing each section, matching the original plasterwork so precisely that it became impossible to tell old from new. The oak floors, stained and warped from years of water exposure, were removed, treated, and reinstalled. In areas where the original wood was too damaged to save, new oak was carefully aged and stained to match. Yoon also faced a philosophical question that every preservationist eventually confronts. How much do you restore and how much do you replace? Lynnewood Hall had been stripped of its original furnishings, artwork, and fixtures. Should the restoration attempt to recreate those elements, or should the house be renovated with contemporary interiors? Yoon chose a middle path. He decided to restore the architectural fabric of the building, walls, floors, ceilings, moldings, to their original condition, but the interiors would be updated for modern living. The mansion would have contemporary kitchens, modern bathrooms, climate control systems, Wi-Fi infrastructure. It would be a historical building adapted for 21st century life, not a museum frozen in 1900. The decision was practical, but also controversial. Purists argued that Lynnewood Hall should be restored exactly as Peter Widener had built it, down to the smallest detail. But Yoon countered that a perfect historical recreation would be uninhabitable. No one in the modern world wanted to live without air conditioning, without modern plumbing, without the conveniences that contemporary life demanded. The choice was between a livable restoration and a museum that no one could afford to operate. By 2015, significant progress had been made. The roof was fully replaced with new slate tiles that matched the originals. The windows were restored or replaced with historically accurate replicas. The marble staircase was repaired and stabilized. The exterior limestone was cleaned, revealing the pale golden color that had been hidden under a century of grime. From the outside, Lynnewood Hall began to look like itself again. But the work was far from complete. The interior restoration was moving slowly, hampered by the complexity of the building and the difficulty of finding craftsmen skilled enough to do the work properly. Yoon had initially estimated that the project would take 5 years. By 2015, it was clear that timeline had been overly optimistic. The restoration would take at least 10 years, possibly longer. The costs continued to escalate. Yoon was spending millions annually on the project, and the end was not yet in sight. Reports in the Philadelphia press speculated about whether he would run out of money or patience before the restoration was complete. Some architectural critics questioned whether the project was even worth the cost. Was it responsible to spend tens of millions of dollars restoring a single private mansion when that money could fund affordable housing, schools, or hospitals? Yoon responded to these criticisms with a simple argument. Lynnewood Hall was a piece of American history. It represented an era, a cultural moment, an architectural achievement that could never be replicated. Allowing it to collapse would be a loss not just for Elkins Park, but for the nation. Someone had to save it, and if the government and nonprofit organizations would or could not, then a private individual had to step forward. The preservation community was divided. Some praised Yoon as a hero, a rare example of a rich individual using his resources to protect cultural heritage. Others were more cautious, noting that private ownership meant private control. Once Yoon completed the restoration, Lynnewood Hall would be his home, closed to the public, accessible only to invited guests. The mansion that was built with money earned from public utilities and streetcar systems would become once again a private palace. By 2018, the mansion was structurally sound but still far from complete. The exterior restoration was finished, the roof was secure, the mechanical systems were functional, but the interior work, the detailed restoration of plaster, wood, and stone, continued at a painstaking pace. Rooms that had been empty shells for decades were slowly being brought back to life, one careful repair at a time. Yoon gave occasional interviews, always carefully managed, showing photographers selected rooms to document the progress. The images revealed spaces that looked simultaneously ancient and new, original architectural details restored to perfection, but empty of furniture, art, and the accumulated layers of life that make a house a home. The question that everyone asked but no one could answer was this: when the restoration was finally complete, what would Lynnewood Hall be? Would it be a home, filled with a family and the rhythms of daily life? Would it be a venue for events, a way to generate income that could offset the enormous maintenance costs? Would it be a museum, eventually open to the public after Yoon's death? No one knew. Yoon kept his plans private. He had saved Lynnewood Hall from demolition and decay, but the mansion's future remained uncertain. And beneath all the questions about money, architecture, and preservation, a deeper question lingered. The question that Peter Widener tried to answer when he built the mansion. The question that had haunted every subsequent owner. What is Lynnewood Hall for? It was built to house a dynasty that collapsed. It was supposed to preserve a family legacy that drowned in the Atlantic. It was meant to last forever, but forever is a long time, and nothing lasts without someone willing to fight for it. Richard Yoon was fighting, but even he could not guarantee that the fight would ever truly be won.
The preservation community was divided. Some praised Yoon as a hero, a rare example of a wealthy individual using his resources to protect cultural heritage. Others were more cautious, noting that private ownership meant private control. Once Yoon completed the restoration, Lynnewood Hall would be his home, closed to the public, accessible only to invited guests. The mansion that had been built with money earned from public utilities and streetcar systems would become, once again, a private palace. By 2018, the mansion was structurally sound, but still far from complete. The exterior restoration was finished, the roof was secure, the mechanical systems were functional, but the interior work, the detailed restoration of plaster, wood, and stone, continued at a painstaking pace. Rooms that had been empty shells for decades were slowly being brought back to life, one careful repair at a time. Yoon gave occasional interviews, always carefully managed, showing photographers selected rooms to document the progress. The images revealed spaces that looked simultaneously ancient and new, original architectural details restored to perfection, but empty of furniture, art, and the accumulated layers of life that make a house a home. The question that everyone asked but no one could answer was this: when the restoration was finally complete, what would Lynnewood Hall be? Would it be a home, filled with the family and the rhythms of daily life? Would it be a venue for events, a way to generate income that could offset the enormous maintenance costs? Would it be a museum, eventually opened to the public after Yoon's death? No one knew. Yoon kept his plans private. He had saved Lynnewood Hall from demolition and decay, but the mansion's future remained uncertain. And beneath all the questions about money, architecture, and preservation, a deeper question lingered. The question that Peter Widener had tried to answer when he built the mansion. The question that had haunted every subsequent owner. What is Lynnewood Hall for? It was built to house a dynasty that collapsed. It was supposed to preserve a family legacy that drowned in the Atlantic. It was meant to last forever, but forever is a long time, and nothing lasts without someone willing to fight for it. Richard Yoon was fighting, but even he could not guarantee that the fight would ever truly be won.
As of 2025, Lynnewood Hall stands restored but incomplete, occupied but not fully alive. The work continues, more slowly now, as Richard Yoon methodically brings each section of the mansion back from the edge of oblivion. But the restoration is not just about repairing plaster and replacing marble. It is about confronting a question that America has never fully answered. What do we do with the monuments our ancestors built? Lynnewood Hall is not alone in this limbo. Across the United States, dozens of Gilded Age mansions face similar fates. The Vanderbilt houses, the Astor estates, the palaces built by railroad barons and steel magnates, most are gone, demolished or converted beyond recognition. The few that survived do so as museums, event venues, or, like Lynnewood Hall, private restoration projects funded by individuals wealthy enough to shoulder the burden. But Lynnewood Hall is different from most of these survivors. It was never opened to the public during its golden years. It was never turned into a museum while the family still controlled it. It simply collapsed inward, dying slowly for 70 years, until someone decided to resurrect it, not as a monument to the past, but as a functioning home for the present. This raises uncomfortable questions. Should a building this historically significant be private? Should one person be allowed to own a piece of architectural history that in many ways belongs to everyone? And if private ownership is the only thing standing between preservation and destruction, can we really complain? The staff who once worked at Lynnewood Hall are all dead now. Mrs. Foster, Thomas Brennan, Chef Moreau, the laundresses, the footmen, the grooms, every single person who kept the mansion running during its brief golden age is gone. Their names survive in payroll records and census documents, but their stories have mostly vanished. We know they worked there, we know what they did, but we do not know how they felt about the house, about the family, about the vast gulf between their lives and the lives of the people they served. What we do know is this: they made Lynnewood Hall possible. Without their labor, invisible, essential, unacknowledged, the mansion could not have functioned for even a single day. Peter Widener's fortune bought the materials and paid the bills, but it was working-class hands that built the house, maintained it, and kept it alive for as long as the family remained. And when the family fell apart, those workers were dismissed, cast out, left to find new positions in a world that was rapidly moving away from the kind of domestic service that had sustained them. They were the first casualties of Lynnewood Hall's decline, and they are the ones history remembers least. The Widener family itself is mostly gone as well, at least from the public eye. Joseph Widener, Peter's surviving son, died in 1943. His art collection was donated to the National Gallery, just as his father's had been. The dynasty that Peter tried so desperately to establish lasted exactly 2 generations before fragmenting into scattered descendants who bear the name but not the fortune or the prominence. Eleanor Widener, the Titanic survivor, lived until 1937. She remarried in 1915, just 3 years after losing her husband and son in the shipwreck. Her second husband was a Harvard professor, and together they donated the Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library to the university. The library still stands today, one of the largest academic libraries in the world, a monument to the young man who died trying to save a book. But Eleanor never returned to Lynnewood Hall after Peter died. She could not bear it. The house was too full of ghosts, her husband's voice echoing through the hallways, her son's laughter in the library, the weight of all that had been lost pressing down on every room. She walked away and never looked back. The Titanic connection haunts Lynnewood Hall in ways that go beyond simple historical coincidence. The mansion was built on the idea that wealth could create permanence, that money could protect a family from the chaos and randomness of the world. But the Titanic proved otherwise. No amount of gold, no palatial estate, no art collection could save George and Harry Widener when the ship went down. They drowned like everyone else, their first-class tickets worthless in the freezing Atlantic. That realization that wealth could not guarantee safety or legacy broke something fundamental in Peter Widener, and it is that brokenness that still clings to Lynnewood Hall. The house was never just a home. It was a fortress, a statement, an argument against mortality, and it failed. Today, visitors to Elkins Park can drive past Lynnewood Hall and catch glimpses of it through the trees and gates. The exterior looks magnificent, the limestone gleaming, the windows restored, the roof intact. From a distance, it looks like the mansion Peter Widener dreamed of, grand, solid, eternal. But step closer and the illusion cracks. The grounds, once 480 acres, are now reduced to just over 10. Suburban houses press in on all sides. The grand isolation that Peter insisted on is gone, swallowed by development and time. Lynnewood Hall is no longer a palace on a hill. It is a relic surrounded by modernity, a ghost from 1900 trying to exist in 2025. The restoration has saved the building, but it cannot restore what the building was meant to be. It cannot bring back the family dinners, the elaborate parties, the sense of possibility that filled the rooms when the mansion was new. It cannot resurrect the servants who worked there, the craftsmen who built it, or the people whose labor paid for it. All of that is gone, lost to time and tragedy. What remains is architecture, beautiful, expensive, meticulously maintained architecture. But architecture without purpose is just a collection of rooms, no matter how grand. So what will become of Lynnewood Hall? If Richard Yoon completes the restoration, will he open it to the public? Will future generations be able to walk through the ballroom, climb the marble staircase, stand in the library where Peter Widener spent his final years mourning his son and grandson? Or will it remain private, accessible only to the owner and his invited guests, a palace rebuilt for an audience of one? No one knows, and perhaps that uncertainty is the most fitting legacy of all. Lynnewood Hall was built by a man who thought he could control the future, and it has spent the last century proving him wrong again and again. The mansion is no longer too big to maintain. Richard Yoon has proven that with enough money and determination, even a building this massive can be saved. But it is still too big for what it was meant to be. It was meant to house a dynasty. It was meant to endure for generations. It was meant to prove that a butcher's son from Philadelphia could build something as permanent and respected as the oldest families in America. It did none of those things. Instead, it became a warning, a reminder that wealth can build walls but cannot hold back time, that ambition can create beauty but cannot guarantee meaning, that even the grandest house is only as strong as the people who live in it. Peter Widener died believing he had failed. His son and grandson were dead. His dream of a lasting dynasty was shattered. The mansion he had spent millions building felt like a mausoleum, a monument to loss rather than achievement. But in a strange way, he succeeded. Lynnewood Hall survived. Against all odds, against decades of neglect and decay, against the economic forces that destroyed almost every other mansion of its era, it is still here. Damaged, yes. Diminished, absolutely. But standing. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps survival, in the end, is its own kind of victory. What do you think about Lynnewood Hall? Should mansions like this be preserved, or are they relics of an era we should leave behind? Should they be opened to the public, or is private ownership acceptable if it means the building survives? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Gilded Age architecture and the dark stories hidden behind these grand facades, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which mansion you'd like me to explore next. Your support makes these detailed investigations possible. Lynnewood Hall stands today, restored but uncertain, magnificent but haunted. It is a monument to ambition, to tragedy, and to the strange, stubborn human belief that we can build things that outlast us. Peter Widener built his mansion to last forever. And, in a way, against all odds, it has.